Good morning, folks. It's very kind of you folks who are here on time to leave these lovely spaces at the front for our folks that we know might be trickling in, as we get used to our new spaces and places and all that. I am really delighted to welcome friend of Calvary, friend of mine now, Janelle Baker, to come and speak to us about Christian nationalism. We are in the midst of this season where we are encountering hard and difficult things, but with some sense of hope and digging into the mystery of them. And so I appreciate folks who are showing up to have these conversations and our wonderful guests who have come in to share a little bit of their expertise with us. Janelle is an expert. She teaches in mission and sociology of religion and social justice at Memphis Theological Seminary. She has written articles and books and things. Y'all come on in. Come on. And particularly looking at these questions about some phrases that you might hear today about Christian dominion and the reign of God and this theological language that has very, very real implications even on a Tuesday, especially say on a Tuesday when you might be voting. So looking toward this election season and thinking about the themes that we might be hearing. So I'm grateful that you all are all here. I'm grateful to Janelle for being here. One word to the community as folks are making their way. Good morning, y'all. You can do us a favor to be good guests of Grizzlies Prep by taking out what you brought in. This is like a camping. Like, don't leave behind cups and things like that. It'll help us be good guests to our Grizzlies Prep hosts. So on your way out, look around and pick up a cup if you see one. Okay, that's all the housekeeping. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's so good to be back here. I always appreciate the warm hospitality of Calvary, and it's a second home to me. And you might see my children sometimes. They sing in the choirs here, so it's really good to be back. I have organized our time together with a series of questions. So I want to start out with the obvious one. What is Christian nationalism? And I know there are various definitions floating around, so I just love to hear from you. You know, there's no wrong answer here. What do you associate with the term Christian nationalism?
Well, I do with Sinclair.
Okay.
Fascism will come to the United States with the Bible, the flag.
Okay, so you associate it with fascism?
Yep.
And the sense of a marrying of the Bible and a sense of patriotism.
You can't disagree because God's put us here.
Okay, right. So a divine sanction for a particular group in power. Okay. Yes.
I heard another definition along with that one on the program. I think it was NPR that said there was a patriotic nationalism when you would just say, you could say the Pledge of Allegiance that you were loyal to the nation, but your Christianity was not particularly involved in it.
Okay, so there's
you were a nationalist, but not a Christian nationalist.
Okay, so again, we see this fusion. Okay, good. Anybody else?
I just picture the cross with the flag with it. In fact, for a gravestone, we were thinking of putting a cross for someone's gravestone, and we wanted a cross and but not with the flag with it. We actually tried to think how we wanted to put it. But
Sure.
That's what image comes.
Yeah, so
I don't know if I'm correct.
Well, you can see this image right here. The cross is reflected through the flag, and this sense of, and I think with often light is involved, right? But the cross is an image, of a public execution. When we think quite literally of Jesus' death, right? James Cone talks about it as a lynching. And so if we see the cross as this, statement of power and connecting it with the flag, we have a particular interpretation, right, of that image. Well, thank you for those contributions. So this is just a definition from Britannica that I wanted to compare. So Christian nationalism seeks to create or maintain a fusion of Christian religion with the nation's character, Advocates consider Christianity to be an integral part of their country's identity and want the government to promote or even enforce the religion's position within it. So we can look at Christian nationalism outside of the US context, right? It's not just the US context. That there's this general frame of reference for Christian nationalism, so a fusion of Christianity and the identity of a nation. And then the second part, that there is a role of the government to promote or enforce. And so, there's various examples. I think that the Nazi Party in Germany is and your connection to fascism. But that idea of we are a Christian nation, this is part of our identity, and historically there has been state churches in Europe, right? So now I think that promoting is pretty informal, but people still pay taxes to support state churches in Europe. But part of the idea of the U.S., this is another question, to what extent is the U.S. Christian? But the founding of this country had a very different relationship, right, in mind for church and state. So this next definition is specifically reflecting on Christian nationalism in the U.S. This is a book that came out in 2020, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, they're sociologists, and it was their book had a lot of survey research pulled from different sources trying to define Christian nationalism, but particularly in the U.S. context. So again, we see this, the cross and the flag, the Christian flag and the U.S. flag. But advocating for a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. And they go a little bit further in terms of what Christian nationalism looks like specifically in the U.S., that America has always been Christian. So there's a mythology, there's a historiography at work here, right? And that it should always be Christian from top to bottom, right? So it's not just people are Christian, but that there should be a governance that is Christian, right? So in its self-identity, interpretations of its history, symbols, values, public policies. But what they argue in this book, and again, this is based on statistically significant survey research, is that it is also associated with all sorts of other things, and really Christian nationalism is more of an identity than it is a religion or a religious ideology, and that correlated with Christian nationalism is support for nativism, so an anti-immigrant bent, white supremacy, an authoritarian style of government or leadership, often with that support for militarism. Patriarchy is also another important part of a very hierarchical system of who should be in charge and who should have power. This is a book that came out even more recently. This is Catherine Stewart, and she is, the title of her book is The Power Worshippers, right? And I think what Catherine Stewart, who's a journalist, and many others have argued is that essentially this is about power, and it is about power for a particular contingent of society, and oftentimes a sense that that power that they have always taken for granted is under threat, and so it is about reclaiming that power. And there is a new documentary that is out that is based on this book. It's called God and Country. It came out in February. So if you want to watch a depressing documentary, I recommend it. This is another book by a journalist, Tim Alberta, and his book is more qualitative, so Catherine Stewart's is as well, but he's kind of going to communities and interviewing people and seeing what they have to say about their sense of identity. And you'll notice with this title, right, this sense of the kingdom, the power, and the glory, that there is this idea that Christians, I think often the way that it is framed, are ambassadors of the kingdom of God, right? So there's this special responsibility. And so the theological justification is this sense of we are the ones who are called to advance God's kingdom. And so this is a holy pursuit, right? But that so much of it is connected to power then, right? So our power is representative of God's power. So this is how it's justified, right? Most folks wouldn't say, oh, I'm out to seek power for my group of people. No, it's God is on the throne, and as Christians, we represent God's dominion, and so therefore this is a calling. And you can see those connections too to a European colonial framework, right? That sense of marrying the cross and the flag. We have seen this many times before, right? Enter Donald Trump. And many scholars have argued that Trump is not a surprise, and that Trump did not create Christian nationalism, and that Donald Trump is not even a Christian nationalist, but that Donald Trump has harnessed Christian nationalism. And some folks have said, what is it with this wave or tide of Christian nationalism? And I can't remember the scholar, but I heard recently that perhaps the metaphor of a reservoir is more helpful. That there's always sort of this energy, and then sometimes that energy comes to the fore, right? Well, I went to a tiny little college in Northwest Iowa, Dordt College, and to my horror, in January of 2016, at my alma mater, Trump said these words. He also said, this is the place where he said, I could shoot somebody up on Fifth Avenue and no one would care, right? So he said, Christianity will have power. If I'm in the White House, you're going to have plenty of power, right? So that sense of a coalition of those seeking power for their interest group, right, was harnessed with Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and we see this, I think, continuing. So in many ways, it is an alliance that is based on, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? We see this with the promise of Supreme Court justices, right? And Trump delivered on those promises, so many Christian nationalists have been very happy with him. You saw earlier, Catherine had the book Jesus and John Wayne. This was written by a friend of mine that I went to college with. So she also, highlighted this event at our alma mater. But this sense of a authoritarian, tough guy, macho sort of approach to masculinity also being connected with Christian nationalism, and we can see the through lines, throughout American history. We'll talk in a minute about to what degree Christian nationalism is evangelical. So, who are Christian nationalists? This is from the Public Religion Research Institute, and this is really recent survey data. It's just from 2023. So about 10% of the country are the diehard adherents, and we've got about 19% as sympathizers. So about 30% of the country, would sort of identify with Christian nationalism to one degree or another. And there have been different questions, to determine what constitutes Christian nationalism or who fits into this camp. These are the statements that were asked in this particular survey. So the U.S. should declare America a Christian nation, U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. So you've got the identity, you've got the enforcing in the law. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a Christian country anymore. So there's that fear of, a loss of goodness for the country, or that the country's going to fall apart. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. You see this with even the question of Barack Obama's, focusing on Barack Hussein Obama and trying to get a record of his birth certificate, right? So being suspicious of Muslim lawmakers or atheist lawmakers. Sometimes Jewish folks are folded in, the Judeo-Christian heritage, but we've also seen on that question, you look at Charlottesville, and the Jews will not replace us slogan, right? So the degree to which Judaism is kind of grandfathered in, this is an open question, I think. And then finally, this dominion, right? God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Sometimes you will see language of lordship being used, particularly among the more reformed contingent. So the idea of, if Jesus is Lord over all creation, and who, are Jesus' representatives on earth other than us, so then we must exercise dominion. And again, it is seen as a calling, not as this power-hungry grab, right? So who are Christian nationalists? And again, there are different scales. I'm sorry, it might be hard to see this, but there are different scales depending on what questions are used, right? But the most likely suspects are white evangelical Protestants, right? And that's probably not a surprise to anybody. So over 50% of white evangelical Protestants are either adherents or sympathizers, but they are not the only ones, right? So almost 50% of other Protestants of color are also Christian nationalists. So, Christians who are, Asian immigrants, so, and then we've got Hispanic Protestants here, Black Protestants, there's even a fairly large number of Black Protestants. Among white mainline Protestants, over 30% are either adherents or sympathizers. Of course, you can see that the adherents categories is much larger with the white evangelical Protestants, right? So you do not have to be a white evangelical Protestant to be a Christian nationalist, but there is a correlation. This is also interesting that most Christian nationalists attend religious services regularly, but not all, right? So there are some Christian nationalists who do not even go to church. And this is why some sociologists and historians will talk about it more as an identity than a religious commitment. And perhaps it's both. Here we see by political party and then by news source. So as you can see here, again, not a surprise, most Christian nationalists are Republican, but there are independents and Democrats also. And then we have most trusting of far-right news, that's the majority. And one of the arguments or commentaries of some, I think, religious leaders as well as sociologists is that people's conception of media probably has much more influence on their belief system and their identity than what they hear in church. And I know this is, very frustrating for a lot of religious leaders. It's like, well, what you say on the pulpit on Sunday, then if somebody's listening to, Newsmax for 50 hours the rest of the week, what do you think is going to be more powerful, right? The correlates of Christian nationalism. We talked about this a little bit with the Whitehead and Perry book, but this comes from PRRI, so I just want to mention them as well. Again, this is a national representative survey, and they approve, and again, not all Christian nationalists would, sign on the dotted line here, but that these tend to be associated with Christian nationalism. So if you maintain a Christian nationalist, if you answer yes to those questions, there's a good chance you will also hold these views, right? So approve authoritarian tactics like demanding people show respect for national symbols. We saw this, with the whole Colin Kaepernick thing and, kneeling during the national anthem, right? Fear and distrust of religious minorities, including Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. Condoning police violence toward Black Americans. Distrusting accounts of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. So a real opposition to the notion that there's systemic racism in the US. Believing that racial inequality is due to the personal shortcomings of minority groups. So the sense of if they would just obey the law, or if they would be respectful, or if they would get a job, or so blaming people for the injustices that they face. Being uncomfortable with interracial marriage and transracial adoption, so you can see some of the segregationist views have some longevity here. Anti-immigrant views, fearing refugees, and then being opposed to science education in schools. So you see some of this with the overlap during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then teaching evolution in schools, sex ed, and then finally believing that men are better suited for public leadership roles while women are better suited for children and the home. So, patriarchal views of gender as well. So the question, I think, some say we should just name this as it is. We should say white Christian nationalism. And others will say, well, it's not, you could be a Christian nationalist and not be white. But I think that it is important to see that there also are correlates, right? And that whether you are white or not, there is support for a social order that maintains white cultural dominance and political dominance, right? So although it is not just white evangelical Protestants who are Christian nationalists, that is the most likely category of people. In this book, we've got, so Samuel Perry teamed up with another sociologist, the flag and the cross. They are specifically looking at white Christian nationalism. And what they basically argue in this book is that Christian nationalism is a white identity movement. And that is the best way for us to understand it, as this white identity movement. So the next question I want to focus on is, why has Christian nationalism gained traction? Why now are we seeing all of this, and why is this, why are we having the January 6th situation at the Capitol with all of these people coming in with all of these religious symbols? Why now? And I think what is important to keep in mind is that there is a long history of Christian nationalism, right? We could go back to Constantine, right? So some of you may be familiar with the story of Constantine, who was the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity and made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire by this vision that he has of a cross, and in the vision he hears the words, "In this conquer," He wins the battle, and then, this is oversimplification, but Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire, and then about a century later, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So there is a long history in Christendom, right? And even this notion of that you would have a Christendom, that you would have a territory that is associated with a religion, right? It's very much a marrying of church and state, of political power and the church. But in the U.S. too, we have, the notion of manifest destiny, and that this is, the Puritan vision of a city on a hill, and that this land was, so there's lots of mythology surrounding Christian nationalism that we can go back to. And when Christian nationalists say the U.S. is a Christian country, that's not historically accurate in terms of what the founders had in mind, but certainly we have this mythology that can be traced far back into our country. Even this sort of like the Solomon's image of Jesus, which is perhaps the most common image of Jesus. You can see this in churches all over the place, right? We don't know what Jesus looked like, but we do know Jesus did not look like that, right? So the question of why, we've got a long history, right, of Christian nationalist ideas, but sociologists have also pointed out that this particular wave of Christian nationalism is perhaps a response to the decline in the number of Christians, the rapid decline in the number of Christians, particularly white Christians in the United States, right? So here we can see this is from 2003. We've got Christians are in the United States are representing about 83% of the population, right? Then 2017, this is from ABC News. This is 72% of the population. So, since the dawn of the 21st century, we have seen a pretty rapid decline. And then this is 2022, and you can see that the number of Christians is about 2/3. So, that has been a precipitous drop. Well, another, I think, important part of this particular pie chart is if you look at the turquoise numbers here, the turquoise numbers are those who are white Christians, right? So if, unofficially the U.S. was a WASP country, right, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASPs are now in a small minority. Even white Catholics, you add white Catholics and white Orthodox Christians, you're still in a minority, right? And even this notion that white Catholics are okay, this is a fairly new notion for many white Protestants, right? And it's like, well, I guess at least you're kind of like us, right? So it wasn't even really until the middle of the 20th century that we start to see more friendliness between white Catholics and Protestants, again, perhaps connected to the sense of decline, right? So we can see in 1972, I think this number, this helps us see the decline of white Christians. This comes from Pew. It's about 90% of the population in 1972, and now it is, or this is just Christians in general, not white Christians. So 63% of the population. You can see the religiously unaffiliated went from 5% to 29%. Among the millennials and Gen Z, we're looking at closer to about half of millennials and Gen Z. And this, I think, is interesting because so often there's been this fear of people who are other religions, right? Muslims in particular. but we're only looking at about a 1 or 2% increase, right? And what's also interesting is that the vast majority of immigrants to the United States are Christians. And the immigrants have higher percentages of Christian identity than people who were born in this country. So, that the anti-immigrant, persuasion would be fear of the non-Christian other. That's just not accurate, right? So if we look at white Christians in general, we can see, so this is from the Pew, this comes from a lot of sources, combining a lot of sources. Pew, PRRI, the American Values Survey, and this is looking at both white evangelical Protestants, white mainline, and white Catholic. You can see it's a decline for all of these, right? And I think it's important to note that sometimes there has been this perception, oh, well, the white mainline is dying, and true Christianity, or evangelical Christianity, is thriving. And if the mainline wasn't so liberal, then maybe people would want to go to church. But actually, there has been a lot of decline among evangelicals too. That the denomination right now that is hemorrhaging the highest percentage of members, does anybody know what it is?
Southern Baptist.
Southern Baptist. So there has been a decline that many scholars have connected with the growth of Christian nationalism, that there's this sense of diminishment. And diminishment is very difficult for people, right? It brings fear, change is hard, there's a sense of being under threat, your way of life, your values, nobody cares about them anymore, you're losing your footing. Also, I think if we look at the global picture, even the idea as Christianity as somehow a white European phenomenon, if you look in 1900, that was perhaps true, right? We've got most Christians are living in Europe, and beyond that, we've got Latin America and North America. But if you look in 2019, you can see that most Christians are living in Africa. So the global picture even then of Christianity as a white European religion or an aspect of European culture and then European settlers in other parts of the world, that's changed a lot too, right? Jamar Tisby, some of you may be familiar with him. He's been here a couple of times. But he has written about that white supremacy and anti-black racism, that this has a very long history, right, in American Protestantism in particular, right? So we can see this perhaps surge of white Christian nationalism, but the ingredients have been there, right? This is Marcia Pally, and what she is doing in her work is connecting white evangelicalism and white Christian nationalism with populist movements. We can also see populist movements around the globe, right? So in Brazil and Hungary, in Italy, there's many other places where we see these populist movements. So there's also this connection in Christian nationalism to a fear of the elites, a sense that nobody cares about us and our interests, and what about those of us who are just like working hard and plugging away, so that these populist sentiments, and then oftentimes you get somebody with a large ego and makes a lot of promises about might and power and how they're going to be your voice and they're going to stick it to the man. And that's very attractive for people who feel beleaguered and like their way of life is in decline. So this notion then of making America great again very much feeds into Christian nationalist sentiments, especially with this idea of America was great. It was Christian. It was this promised land. You even see this mythology around the new Israel, right? So it can be that again. And even this notion, this messianic notion we saw at the beginning, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, right? That sense of a messianic role given to a particular figure. So many of you are probably familiar with these numbers, but the Trump movement was very prominent among white evangelicals, both in 2016 and 2020. This is from 2016, but the numbers were really similar in 2020. Many of the, certainly not all white evangelicals are Christian nationalists, but the Republican Party now has a very strong wing that is Christian nationalists. And then even the religious identity of Donald Trump. There was a lot of energy spent around, James Dobson called Trump a baby Christian. There were a lot of questions of, well, how can this guy who, he's had all these affairs and he doesn't even, know how to hold a Bible right side up and doesn't know how to pronounce 2 Corinthians and, how can this guy even claim to be a Christian? But there was a lot of energy on how Trump is God's anointed. Here you've got Trump holding up that book that was written by Stephen Strange in Davos. You have this other one, The Faith of Donald Trump, sort of showing how, he has embraced Christianity, and you get a lot of the sense of like, he's like David, he may even be somebody who has this checkered past, that he is God's person for the job, right? I also want to talk a little bit about some sociological analysis, and then I want to make sure we save some time for conversation as well. But this is a sociologist who looked at fascism in Italy. So, looking at in Italy that there was this sort of, even though there had been a lot of secularization, with the rise of fascism in Italy, you see some reconnections to the Catholic Church, right? And what he argues is that what we see in Christian nationalism is often a sacralization of politics. So politics itself takes on religious significance. And Michelle Margolis in the United States has taken on that idea as well. And she's a political scientist who talks about how we often will notice how people's faith informs their politics, but perhaps we don't spend enough energy on how people's politics informs their faith. And what we're seeing is that partisanship and the political environment is increasingly shaping people's religious identity. So even people identifying as evangelicals who don't go to church, they don't have a lot of connections to it, but this is what me and my group are, right? So this notion of politics increasingly shaping our religious identities. And with Christian nationalism, you get this fusion that seems like it would be a religious identity, but it's really more of a political perspective. We can also look at the culture wars in the U.S., that have this long history. But increasingly, and historically, the culture wars were those who favored individual identity versus those who wanted social order. But increasingly, what we're seeing with the culture wars is identity politics, right? So it's how much power is my group going to have compared to yours. This is Robert Jones. He is a sociologist who is connected to the Public Religion Research Institute. And I thought this quote was worth repeating. The Trump era has effectively turned white evangelical political ethics on its head. Rather than standing on principle and letting the chips fall where they may, white evangelicals have now fully embraced a consequentialist ethics that works backward from predetermined political ends, refashioning or even discarding principles as needed to achieve a desired outcome. And even this language of, well, we're in a crisis. Being nice is not going to cut it. That is increasingly an ethos that you will find among particularly white evangelicals who have embraced this movement. And the January 6th insurrection, and again, I do not want to suggest that all white evangelicals supported the January 6th insurrection, but there was a lot of that language of, this is where the rubber meets the road, and so ordinary values of seeking consensus or being kind, we have to throw those out because this is a crisis and we are at risk of losing our identity. I'm going to skip this quote from Kristen Cobus May, other than to mention that this question of what does it mean for Christians to have a prophetic voice, right? And with an embrace of an attempt to preserve the status quo, it's easy for that prophetic voice to be lost. I also wanted to briefly mention, this is James Davison Hunter. He has written a lot about, so he wrote a book about the culture wars, he's written a lot about evangelicals, he has that background himself. But this book, I found a really interesting perspective. So the subtitle is The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World. And particularly this notion of changing the world. I don't know about you all, but when I was growing up, that was drilled into me. You can change the world, right? And it was almost this, sense of like, well, if you're going to be a dental hygienist, you're a major disappointment because how are you changing the world, right? But particularly messages that white American Christians have received that you are the ones, right? And I think for myself anyway, now I can see so many of these messages as really misplaced that, we all are called to do good in the world, but for most of us, our influence is probably going to be pretty small, right? And that doesn't discount what we are called to do, but these grand visions of you are called to change the world, that it can feed, an overly ambitious ego or a sense of, not being aware of your own blind spots or your own failings or how this can dominate others, but how even this notion of, those who are given this inheritance, and it's our Christian inheritance, and we must carry it forward, but how damaging that can be. I'm gonna skip these two. We have many examples of, the messianic Trump. But I also wanted to just briefly mention, this is Josh Hawley. He's a senator in Missouri. You may be familiar, this is an iconic image now of Josh Hawley. He's going into the Capitol, and this is raised in solidarity with the insurrectionists on January 6th. And his background is, or he still identifies as a Reformed Presbyterian Christian. And he said many things similar to this, but I just want to highlight this one. Government serves Christ's kingdom rule. This is its purpose, and Christians' purpose in politics should be to advance the kingdom of God, to make it more real, more tangible, more present. So you've got that image of the kingdom, the lordship, and how this is a Christian responsibility. I want to turn now to the question that is at the heart of Christian nationalism. Is the U.S. a Christian country, right? And this is part of the mythology of Christian nationalism, that the U.S. is a Christian country. This is David Barton. He's a pseudo-historian. Tim is probably familiar with him. But he's written a number of books trying to argue that, the U.S. is a Christian nation. None of these books are peer-reviewed. None of them are published by, academic publishers. But this, he's trying to paint a picture of, all the founders were Christians, and they had this vision, for a Christian society. But I think those of us who are familiar with American history know that this is not the case, right? That in God we trust, even this was not added to American coinage until the 1950s. And the vision of the founders was much more this idea of out of many one, right? E pluribus unum. So you've got the 13 colonies, you've got 13 letters, and the slogan. We're coming together out of many identities and differences to form one nation. And certainly we can see how there have been, very prominent aspects of American history that have not been democratic. Women didn't have the right to vote. Millions of people were enslaved. We have the genocide of Native Americans. We have many, many examples, but that doesn't mean that that was not the vision that the founders, at least impartially and imperfectly tried to set forward, right? So if we look on what does it mean for the U.S. to be a Christian country, it depends. What is our definition of Christian, right? Are we talking about just the people there are Christians? Well, if so, perhaps, right? We still have about 2/3. But again, that's shrinking. Identity. Are we Christian just because that's culturally how we identify ourselves? Is it our heritage? What about our values? Why don't we look at the U.S. military's actions around the world? Are those Christian? Probably not according to the people who have, the civilians who have been bombed, right? Or the countries in which the U.S. has, supported a dictator. So these questions then of, is the U.S. a Christian country? I think it's really important to tease out, and even if you're encountering people with Christian nationalist sensibilities, what do you mean by that? And is Christian nationalism Christian? I think is another important question. Again, it probably depends on what you mean, right? And I think it is important for us to acknowledge, we can very much embrace our perspective on Christianity, right? And we have texts and tradition and community to go back on. But I think it's also important to understand that Christians are a very diverse group, right? And so perhaps we also need to say, well, that person's claiming to be a Christian. I see my faith very differently, but I guess they're claiming it too, right? So that sense then of, I think it can be easy for those of us who do not identify with Christian nationalism to say, oh, well, that's just, that's a perversion, right? But I think it's also important for us to recognize that we all share this identity. So how are we going to negotiate that identity together? You may be familiar with this group. This is Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is a really, I think, interesting way of framing. If you're interested, you can go on their website and look at, what ideas they have. What are the alternatives to Christian nationalism? This is a bus of a pastor going around the Faith, Hope, and Love bus, which I found interesting. I think it's important for us to consider what we mean by power and God's power. I've always loved this image of Robert Farrar Capon of the power of the gospel is a power with and for rather than over. He talks about left-handed power, a very different vision of power. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about the powerlessness of God, that it is God's suffering and solidarity with suffering that is the power of the gospel. Howard Thurman talked about Jesus' identity as someone with his back against the wall, and for those with their backs against the wall. You can see this. Sorry, I'm going kind of fast here, but I want to have a little time for conversation. That the Catholic worker movement, we've got this round table, right? Oscar Romero, right before he was killed, he got on national radio and said to the paramilitary Catholics in El Salvador, "In the name of God, in the name of our tormented people, I beseech you, I implore you, in the name of God, I command you to stop the repression." And then I want to just skip to how can we respond? And the title of this series is Living Faithfully and Fearing Not, right? And so these are just, some ideas that I have in terms of, or many others have had as well. But Christians, first of all, as advocates for the common good, and particularly those who are voiceless, those who are suffering. Building solidarity across cultural and religious differences, and that being a call for Christians, especially as the largest group in our society. The life and teachings of Jesus being a good place to start. And then I think, in this social media world, we've probably learned over the last few years that the angry war of words on social media, they never really get us anywhere. But that trading information, inviting conversation, expressing curiosity, that these are ways that, that there can be a temptation just not to engage at all, but perhaps these are ways.
Excuse me, Rachel? Yeah. Jack's not feeling well. Oh, okay. He's in the restroom. Okay, sorry, that's okay.
So I know that we just have a couple of minutes, but questions or comments from you? Yes?
One topic you didn't mention is I would call machismo.
Uh-huh.
And culturally it's a big thing when Putin took over power and, make Russia great again. And he actually hired people to come and do bodybuilding, and people and one of the famous pictures of him all muscular on bareback on a horse.
Right.
Kind of machismo. And you see it culturally here, like males, to be male, they want to try to pick up. They may live in an apartment downtown Memphis, but they have a 4-wheel drive pickup that's all jacked up, and how much of that is, you didn't mention that, but this male machismo, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene made this comment, if you let the Democrats and liberals take over, they're going to steal your masculinity.
Oh yeah,
She said they're going to take away your masculinity as a male.
Right.
So how much is that a part of the?
Oh, I think it's very.
It's kind of like an underland.
Yes.
Some people that are not identified as evangelicals would call Trump the tiger.
Right.
See what I'm saying?
Yes.
And that's kind of hidden. How much of that is?
Yeah. Well, and the book by Kristen Kobus and Dumais, Jesus and John Wayne, that's her big argument, is like you've got Jesus as the John Wayne figure, right? So I think that that machismo is very much part of the picture. And she actually had a piece this week on the Ken problem. So I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Barbie, but if the only identity for a man is to be an alpha man, there can only be one man, because then everybody else is a threat, right? So I thought that was an interesting way to frame it.
I guess it's a comment really, but I do think that the power component of it is so fundamental in understanding like why this is happening right now and what the motivations are, because I do sense that a lot of it is about fear of losing the position of white male,
right,
and all of that. There's so many cultural things happening in the United States that causes that group to sort of feel like they are losing power and what's going to happen, and so that fear drives all this, craziness.
Right. Yeah, and that sense of power as an important part of being human, or of being somebody who matters in the world.
So I'm supposed to go to a weekend with two other couples. The husbands were fraternity brothers of mine, and they're close friends, and I love them dearly. And they're both red as they can be. So how do I survive this weekend? Because they're going to drag me into it.
I think alcohol is the only.
Lots of alcohol.
Alcohol's not the right answer. You fall into arguments when you have alcohol.
Right. Yeah.
Not the solution.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have these, I think most of us in this room probably have similar situations. And it does seem that, it is very easy to fall into the arguments, but they do not help. So, yeah, I think the question, all of us have to discern when to engage, when not to. But sometimes even offering to trade, I'll listen to you, you listen to me, or like, well, yeah, send me that article, and I'll send you this one. That can be, because no one likes to be patronized, right? No one likes to be told they're wrong. No one likes to be thought of as stupid. So, yeah, I think, and sometimes, changing the subject or leaving the room is not a bad idea. But all the best to you in your weekend.
Let us know that. Discuss forwards.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could share with us a list of the books that are included in the presentation.
Yes, I will get that. Tim, will you?
Thank you for your work. Just one question. So looking at the charts and the graphs and all that, is age a factor at all? Like, so my sense is that Christian nationalists kind of skew older. Is
yes,
that right?
It skews baby boomer. But as people age, they're more likely to get into it too. So I think that's the question of, is there always like a fresh supply of folks who are, that there's a temptation to this perspective. So, but yes, it does skew older.
Do we know if this group that's increasing, the non-religious, become Christian nationals, or do they continue their life not identifying with religion at all?
So the folks that are not religious and are Christian nationalists are mostly older. So for the young folks who are not religious, for many of them, they're really turned off by this. And when you look at why people leave the church, this idea of the sort of ego-driven quest for power, some folks will articulate that as a reason for leaving the church.
We will get the book list. I'm about halfway through Jesus and John Wayne, and it's great. I feel like it's a really important thing to be reading. And Janelle is staying to the acknowledgments, and we thank Janelle.
Thank you so much.